nationallaw.org. Live now as the National Law Journal is hosting its day after conference, looking into last night's election results and their likely impact on Congress. This is just getting underway.
So he was, wanted to give me a little bit of his wake-up morning news about the outcome of the elections. National Journal remains right in the middle, of course, and doesn't take sides, but we're glad you all are here this morning to kind of get a take of what happened last night and what it means for the future. I want to quickly take a moment to ask you all to please silence your cell phones so that we can have your full attention this morning. We want this to be a lively discussion, and we want to hear from you this morning. So we would welcome your comments, your questions, and your feedback via Twitter, #NJDayAfter. We will also be accepting questions via Twitter, so you'll see that our moderators will have iPads in hand. If you want to pose your question that way, that's fantastic. We will also be circulating with microphones during the event. If you'll just state your name and organization when posing a question, that would be very helpful. I want to give you a quick rundown of this morning's program. First, we will begin with a panel moderated by Ron Fournier about last night, analysis of key election results and outcomes. The next panel, Getting Congress to Govern, will be moderated by Ben Pershing. And the final panel, A Walk Down Influence Alley, a conversation with K Street players, will be moderated by Michelle Cottle. Closing the program will be a conversation with Charlie Cook. This morning's event would not be possible without the generous support of the American Society of Anesthesiologists and United Technologies. Here this morning to provide opening remarks is Paul Pomerantz, Chief Executive Officer of the American Society of Anesthesiologists. Welcome, Paul. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, and good morning. We are very excited to be here and look forward to this very interesting program of analysis and discussion regarding the impact of yesterday's elections and the impact that they'll have on the country moving forward. Just as all of you, we at the American Society of Anesthesiologists watched with great interest yesterday's election. Our 52,000 members are deeply affected by the actions of government, and we look forward to continuing our role as a political advocate and healthcare community leader. ASA and our members are represented in Washington, D.C. by our Chief Advocacy Officer, Manuel Bonilla, and his legislative, regulatory, and political team. As one of the largest healthcare political action funds in the nation, we also make it a priority to support candidates who understand the critical role physician anesthesiologists serve in providing care to Americans. One of the most important issues to our physician anesthesiologist members is patient safety. ASA has been a leader in advancing patient safety and improving the quality of care our members deliver to patients since before the term patient safety was even part of our national lexicon. We always have been and continue to be the leading medical specialty championing the safety of health care for our patients. When seconds count, physician anesthesiologists save lives. ASA is proud to serve the needs of patients, providing our members the tools and knowledge necessary to deliver the best and safest medical care possible while advancing the practice of anesthesiology. As part of our commitment to patient safety, ASA also works to advance innovative new models in healthcare delivery and payment, including the perioperative surgical home, ideas for relieving our nation's drug shortage problems, team-based anesthesia care, and patient access to high-quality and effective pain medicine. As the healthcare landscape continues to evolve, we look for opportunities to apply ASA's commitment to patient safety and quality of care to state and federal legislation and regulation. With that, we'd like to thank you once again for coming to today's Day After event, and we look forward to enjoying this very important program with you. With that, I'll turn it back to Poppy in the National Journal. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right, we're going to get started with our first panel about last night, analysis of key election results and the outcomes. I want to welcome to the stage Ron Fournier, who is a senior reporter for National Journal. And Ron will be joined on stage by Whit Ayers, founder and president, North Star Opinion Research, Celinda Lake, president of Lake Research Partners. Ron, I'll let you go ahead and get started.
Sorry, I was doing an interview back there with Celinda. So thank you all for coming. I know this is going to be a real good conversation. Whit and Celinda have been very good sources and political mentors of mine over the years, kind of keeping me straight, and hopefully they can shed some light on what happened last night. Since we're dealing with a couple pollsters, I was going to start with a handful of numbers that really jumped out at me with the exit polls, and then maybe a thought experiment for our guests, and I would like you guys to think of this thought experiment as well, and maybe it can feed some good questions when we get towards the end of this. So if you look at the exit polls, a little over a majority of the electorate who voted last night disapprove of President Obama, no surprise. 80% disapprove of Congress as an institution. 60% disapprove of their leadership in Congress and at the White House. Only 44% of the people who voted have a positive opinion of the Democratic Party. Less than that, 40%, have a positive opinion of the Republican Party. 2/3 of the country thinks the nation's on the wrong track. Only 22% of Americans right now think the next generation is going to be better than the current one. Only 22% of the public still thinks there's such thing as an American dream. So here's a thought experiment. If last night, let's wave a magic wand, if people who were voting last night had the same buffet of choices in politics that they have in the theater, where they're going to shop, how they're going to shop, where they're going to eat, how they're going to eat, all this, we're in an era of choice now. If people had that kind of buffet of choice in politics last night, how many Republicans and Democrats would have been thrown out of office? Celinda, Whit, why don't you answer that question? How much of the Republican victory yesterday was choice between two evils?
There's no question that people are disgusted with Washington and discouraged about the state of the nation. But let's not mistake who won and who lost yesterday. Yesterday was a whopping rejection of this president and this president's agenda. The people who lost yesterday were Democrats. Republicans picked up or will pick up 9 Senate seats and are within an eyelash of picking up a 10th in Virginia. We defeated 5, or will defeat after Louisiana runoff, 5 Senate incumbents. We are going to pick up at least 11 seats and maybe get the largest majority in the House since World War II. We held the governorship in Florida and picked up 3 governorships in deep blue states of Maryland, Massachusetts, and Illinois. So it's pretty clear which party lost yesterday and which party won.
Well, no, the second part is not clear. All that's clear yesterday is that your party was able to prove that yesterday you weren't quite as bad as the other guys.
Ron?
So going forward, how does the Republican Party turn yesterday's Democratic defeat into a true governing that improves the Republican brand going forward?
By demonstrating that we can govern. The smartest politicians I've ever worked with all believe that people vote for things as well as against things. They vote for positive agendas as well as against agendas they don't like. And that's one reason why RNC Chairman Reince Priebus put together about the 1st of October a list of 11 positive principles that Republican candidates can stand behind. It covers the array of various policy areas, and that's the first place I think a Republican Congress can go. Is that set of positive principles and show that they can govern.
Celinda, I would suggest, and what if you disagree, you can come back to it later, that we didn't see many of those principles presented by the Republicans in the election. It'd be great if they did it going forward, but it was mainly an anti-Obama election. So first of all, do you agree that last night was a shellacking or a thumping, to use the last 2 president's words, or would you have a better adjective for how badly the Democrats got beat?
Well,
I think
I think that obviously the Democrats got badly beat last night. But I think that there are three things I would say. One, I think the table was set very poorly for the Democrats from the get-go. Structurally, an off-year election, the array of Senate seats that were up, and a midterm election where the turnout of our voters is lower, and we weren't that successful in mobilizing our base to counter those trends.
Why is that, you think? Why couldn't you get your base out? What happens to the coalition of the Ascendant? Has it declined?
Well, the coalition of the Ascendant just turns out every 4 years, not every 2.
That's a big problem, isn't it?
It's a huge
we have elections
problem.
we have elections every 2 years.
It's a huge problem.
Why is it a problem, and what needs to be done
It's a problem that gets better every year, though, because the Republicans are living on borrowed time on their coalition. But I think that you asked, and this is the question I think Democrats have to answer, is why did we have such problem despite great organization in turning out the base, and why did we do so poorly, particularly among independent women? And I think the answer to that is the economy. We did not have, and we did not end on an economic message. We've never won elections when we haven't been ahead on the economy, and on the election eve we were even on the economy, even on jobs, slightly behind on the economy. We only split economic voters. All those voters that you listed, the ones that think the economy's not good, that their kids won't have a better future, we lost those voters.
Whose fault is it that the Democratic Party didn't have an economic message? Would it start at the top?
It starts at the top because I think it's very hard for an individual Senate candidate to articulate an overall economic message. That said, though, one thing I really want to get on...
Let's not move off of that too quickly. Why did the president fumble that? It's his economy.
Well,
why didn't he do a better job of presenting a plan?
I think that you can, either by choice or by circumstance, he had a lot of crises in the fall.
Well, but presidents have to deal with crises and run a campaign. That's not an excuse. That's an explanation.
I would agree. I hope you go call the president and talk to him about that.
What would you tell the president if he would answer your phone call today?
Articulate tomorrow an economic vision for the country and say, just as Bill Clinton did, we have done this, but it's not good enough, and we're going to work with Republicans to get these things done.
And went on that message to the president. Last night his aides were pretty defiant. Matter of fact, one of them was quoted as saying, he does not feel repudiated. What does that bode for us going forward if the president thinks that last night was not a repudiation of his record so far?
One of the lessons from this election is that arrogance will bite you. This president is the most arrogant politician of my entire lifetime. He set his own people up. He really did. He set his own people up. The only way the Kay Hagans and the Mark Pryors and all the other Democrats who lost yesterday were going to survive was to separate themselves from the president. And the president's response is, well, that's fine, they all voted with me anyway, or, while I'm not on the ballot, my policies are. The president made the Republican argument for us. We barely even needed to make it. And the response yesterday was, well, if these Democrats hadn't run away from the president, many of them would have done better. What alternative universe are these people living in? It is breathtakingly arrogant, and this president helped make our case for us and helped sink all of these Democratic senators.
While we're on the topic of arrogance, John Feary, a very well-known and respected Republican consultant, said last night, the hard right is not control of the Republican agenda anymore. The inmates are no longer running the asylum. Do you think that's true? Is the hard right no longer running the Republican Party? And on what would you base that?
I think part of the key for the Republican victories yesterday is that we had candidates that managed to unite the Republican coalition. And that's another takeaway from yesterday, is that candidate quality really, really matters. Across the board, we nominated better candidates who ran better campaigns. Just three quick examples. Cory Gardner in Colorado was a far superior candidate than we nominated the last time. He ran a great campaign, and he won comfortably against a guy who beat the war on women to death, Senator Uterus. And it wasn't even very
That's
close.
Senator, let's get the name right.
Oh, sorry, Mark Udall. Joni Ernst in Iowa was a great candidate who ran a great campaign. And I'm so proud of Ed Gillespie, I'm about to bust. Back in Labor Day, I told Paul Gigot on his Journal editorial report that he needed to keep an eye on Ed Gillespie. He was going to be an upset special, and a lot of people thought I was nuts. But if you know Ed Gillespie, you know how good he is, how smart he is, how good a campaign he ran, and he's within an eyelash of knocking off someone that virtually everybody thought was unbeatable. So
there was
we had better candidates, and we had candidates who could unite the Republican coalition, and of course that's what it's going to take in 2016.
So you didn't really answer the arrogance question. Let me try it another way. There was a poll that came out last week, I think it was NBC, Wall Street Journal, that said the number one issue that voters were looking for in candidates was the economy. A close number two was they're looking for people who will break gridlock. I've seen no evidence this last few years that the President of the United States is either willing or capable of compromising and breaking gridlock, and I've seen no evidence that the Republican Party establishment is willing or able to compromise and break gridlock. Can you disabuse either one of you?
I disagree. I mean, if you listen to Mitch McConnell's speech,
well, words are words.
Right.
Where has there been any action that would suggest that the Republican Party can do this?
Mitch McConnell was pitch perfect last night, and he basically said just what I said to start this panel. We need to demonstrate that we can govern. Mitch McConnell believes that. My senatorial clients who won yesterday believe that.
But the president today is going to say the same thing. Why should we believe that it's any different now?
Because I think that you have an attitude of people who got elected yesterday that realize they need to advance a positive agenda. Whether this president's even willing to work with them or not, I have no idea. He's shown no inclination or particular ability to do so.
So you think the Republicans are incented to compromise?
Oh, yeah. I don't think there's any question about it.
The Democrats, are they incented to compromise?
Well, I think, first of all, I disagree with the assessment that the president hasn't tried to work with the Republicans. I think the president has tried to work with the Republicans.
Well, he's talked about it, but he hasn't been able to get one single compromise. I got to assume that either he can't.
He already reached out today and said, let's get together. And one of the things that we find, if you look academically at the academic studies of productivity, divided government, Congress in one hand, President in the other, far more productive than mixed government.
Why is that, you think?
Because I think that the House and the Senate will be able to agree on a lot and deliver it. And I think neither side is interested in just veto, government by veto. So I think it is greatly incentivized to compromise. When you have one House and one Senate indifferent, they never send anything up.
Right.
The other thing I want to say, though, that I think is the most important lesson of last night, and one would I agree with a lot of what you said, but this is the one thing I don't agree with you on. The Democratic agenda was not rejected last night. Democratic Party and candidates were, and it was very unfortunate. And I think the Republicans were very successful in nationalizing the race.
That's an interesting distinction. Can you flesh it out a little bit?
Sure. And you look at the initiatives across the board. When voters had the ability to directly vote on the issues.
Minimum wage in Arkansas.
Minimum wage in 4 states. Paid sick days in 2 cities in a state. Legalizing marijuana in several states, and you can go on and on, rejecting the two-party primary. I mean, across the board, the Democratic agenda did very well when voters had the ability to vote directly on the issues.
Is that a fair distinction, Whit? And I know it didn't matter yesterday when it came down to the voting, but is that a distinction that the Democratic Party maybe can learn from?
Well, a lot bigger issue than minimum wage or any of these other issues was Obamacare in these critical Senate battleground states. Obamacare was an albatross around the necks of Democrats who voted for it. Not just because of one factor. It's a combination. It's the substance of the law. It is what it represented, a large government intrusion into the healthcare sphere, but also how it was passed. Major social changes get passed by bipartisan majorities if they are going to stick. A majority of House Republicans voted for Medicare in 1965. A quarter of the Senate Republicans voted for Medicare. Medicare Prescription Part D that passed during George W. Bush's administration passed with Democratic votes in both the House and the Senate. Obamacare, we had clients who were perfectly willing to work with the president on a health care reform. And the basic attitude is, we have the votes, we don't need you. Okay. And so they crammed it down the throats of Republicans, changing the rules in the Senate to get it through.
Gotcha.
And created a political issue that basically has killed 7 promising Democratic careers and is going to be an ongoing issue because of the way they passed it.
So I'm going to stipulate that you both were right in your last answers, for the sake of argument, that Democrats have an agenda that on its own can be popular. And in this election, Obamacare was a big anvil, and the president was. 2016 presidential race, we're going to have a completely different electorate.
Right.
The Obama's going to have a step out the door. Obamacare will be 2 years older. How in the world are the Republicans? Oh, and by the way, the country is fastly becoming a majority minority. And the Republican Party still is basically advertises itself as a party of white people.
Now, come on, Ron.
Well, no, that's basically. Oh, that's basically the brand. Now, it'd be interesting if you can push back on that in the next 2 years, but that is the brand. And I think
we do not advertise ourselves as a party of white people. Now,
well, it's an awfully uncomfortable place for a person of color to be right now.
There are many of us who have been arguing for a long time that we need to do a better job reaching out to minorities. We had the Latino vote. 35% of Latinos voted for Republican House candidates yesterday. That's not where we need to be. We need to be up with a 44 to 50% that George Bush got or Kay Bailey Hutchison used to get.
How do you get there in the next 2 years?
Huh? It's all about how we govern and who we nominate. Remember, some of us are old enough to remember the so-called Republican lock on the Electoral College back during the 80s, where there was no way in the world the Democrats were going to be able to elect a president again because we had a lock on the Electoral College. Bill Clinton comes along and says, I want to end welfare as we know it, I'm for the death penalty, and in one election, he turns the Democratic Party around. The Republican Party is one candidate and one election away from resurrection at the presidential level.
Do you see that candidate out there now?
Well, I happen to have a few options. I mean, Marco Rubio's a client of ours, and I happen to think he does more for the Republican Party than anybody else out there, but there are a number of possibilities that can give a new image and a new face for the Republican Party.
What happens if in 2 years we still don't have immigration reform and there's still 11, 12 million people who are working hard in this country but still living in the shadows?
Well, let's not.
How does that affect the Republican Party?
Let's not make those assumptions. I mean, come on. We've got a new Congress that's got a new day.
So you agree that's an important issue that's got to get off the table?
Sure. No question about it. I mean, here's the problem. Yesterday, 75% of the electorate was white. In 2010, it was 77.
Right.
That's a continuation of a pattern of every midterm elections, about 2 percentage points less non-Hispanic white. In the presidential election in 2012, it was 72% white, less than in the midterms, and that goes down about 2%. So we're going to have an electorate in 2016 that's about 70% white, about 30% non-white. It doesn't take a real genius, Ron, to figure out
even my university
we've got to do better
yeah.
among Asians, among Latinos, among African Americans.
So, Slinda, the president was obviously, as you say, was repudiated. If one of the first things he does is by fiat legalizes a lot of illegal immigrants and doesn't work it through the political system and get some bipartisan support, and Wood is exactly right. This kind of legislation, for it to be durable in our history, has to have some bipartisan support. What message would he be sending to the American public? I tweeted yesterday that would be the equivalent of flipping the bird to the American public. Do you agree with that?
Except for the fact that the American public wants... I mean,
American people wants a lot of things, but they don't want necessarily the chief executive to do it on his or her own. They want compromise.
Honestly,
do you think they'd be fine if he just said, nope, I'm going to do this on my own?
I think the number one reason that, I mean, the people that won last night at the governor level, I think, are very illustrative, because they were governors who have to deliver. The Republican governors were able to save themselves because they have to deliver. And I think that is a lesson for the Senate. I mean, you know, I think if the Senate will not if the Senate passes bad immigration reform, that's going to be as bad as not passing any immigration reform. And if the president says, you know, these people will not work with me to have decent and humane and practical immigration reform, I'm just going to get it done, then that's an entirely different message.
Are you sure? Is the public going to buy that explanation? Are they going to say, oh yeah, he tried hard and he couldn't get it done, so he's doing the right thing? Or are they going to say, you know, this is just another politician who's given lip service to compromise, couldn't get it done, and we're going to punish his party again?
Well, for one thing, if you pass immigration reform, however you do it, real people...
I was talking about executive order.
I understand, but by executive order, real people's lives are affected. I mean, real people see something different on Tuesday than they had on Monday. So that, you know, when you get something done, it affects real people's lives.
And it doesn't matter how you get it done? The ends justify the means?
I think it matters less how you get it done than getting it done. I think the major frustration last night was yes, they can't compromise, but they're not getting anything done. And Rome is burning, and they're not getting anything done.
Real quickly on that. Is getting immigration reform done anyway okay?
You can't just pass something. I mean, it's obvious we have a seriously broken system that hurts our economy, that hurts everybody involved with it. And when you have a seriously broken system, it's incumbent on the Congress to fix the system. It is not incumbent on a president to arrogantly try to do it on his own. That's the best way I know to kill immigration reform, is to come out and take an executive order and do something that even he has said should be the province of Congress, and try to do it on his own.
Okay. I want to turn to 2016, but before I do, I have two pollsters up here. I've got to ask about these polls.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
Which were, if you guys are paying attention closely, they were all off. They basically overestimated the Democratic turnout.
Right.
This has got to be a hell of a scary time to be a pollster with the way we're changing and communicating. Can you explain why they were all so off yesterday, and how your business is going to have to change to be more accurate for its political customers?
So I think the number one thing, and it's a group of voters we haven't talked about, I think the number one thing that helps explain why the polls were off is that we overestimated the women's vote. You know, you talked, Whit, about how the electorate was 72% or 75% white. It was more white, it was older, and it was less female. And many of the pollsters, I think, accounted for it being older. Many of the pollsters accounted for it being more white. Most of us did not account for it being less female.
And why not? What went into the thinking to make it the size it was?
Well, because, for example, in 2010, the electorate was not less female. 1994, it was. In some ways, and I'll be interested in your thoughts on this, in some ways the structure of the electorate resembled more 1994 than 2010, where you had this decline among women. In 1994, it was so bad it was called the year of the angry white man.
Right. And
you had also the decline in the proportion of women. I mean, we lost yesterday because we had fewer women, and because we lost women by more than we won men by. We won women by less than we lost men by. And that's a formula for big defeats. So I think women voters are a big piece of last night's story, and one we haven't talked about so much on this panel, and it's a big reason why the polls were off.
Okay.
Ron, I don't accept the premise that the polls were way off. This is a classic wave election. Waves break late. We did Bill Frist's race in Tennessee in 1994. He was up by only 4 points a week to go, the Tuesday before. We polled through the weekend. By Thursday, he was up by 7. By Saturday, he was up by 9, and he won by 14 percentage points. But you would never have caught that unless you polled all the way up to Election Day.
And even polling through the weekend is kind of hinky, right?
No, but if you look at the polls over the course of the last week,
right,
it was very clear that where Democrats were leading, like New Hampshire and North Carolina, the leads were narrowing. And where Republicans were leading, like Iowa, like Colorado, like Arkansas, the leads were widening. I mean, the trend was there clearly. And I think what happened was a classic wave where you came in very late within the course of the last week, and you ended up getting a substantial Republican boost.
All the persuadables went one way.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, that's what a wave is where you have a lot of relatively close states that go the same direction.
Yeah. Okay.
I agree with Whit on that, as well as I also think most of us had an electorate that was 53% female, but I think Whit's making a very, very good point.
Can you quickly, Linda, policy-wise, why women stayed home? What did the Democratic Party do wrong or the Republican Party do right to keep them home?
Well, I think,
or to get more men out, I guess it could be.
I think that the number one thing is men think it's a good day when government hasn't done anything bad to you. And this is the challenge for Republicans, is that women want government to get something done. And women had major concerns on their minds, incredibly concerned about this economy and the impact it was having on their families, and a belief that no one really understood their kitchen table economics. And the second thing was the security, the mounting security concerns about the instability. I mean, ISIS, Ferguson, Ebola. I mean, women in particular, thinking new crisis after new crisis after new crisis of things I've never even heard of and can barely pronounce, affecting my family.
Why does that keep them home and not out?
Because no one spoke to them. Because I think they felt no one spoke to them. No one gets my life. No one is doing anything for me, and I've got a lot on my mind.
That makes sense
already.
to me. What do you think, Whit? Is that?
First of all, let's not make too much of this. A majority of the people who voted yesterday were female. It was 51-49.
But it was less than we...
It was less,
Tennessee, right?
a point or so less. But it wasn't like there was a huge shift in the gender balance of the electorate that voted yesterday. Women have a tendency to place a higher priority on issues like education, on issues like health care. And I think any politician, Republican or Democrat, who hopes to appeal to women has got to have something intelligent to say about both of those issues. We don't have as many people as we need to be able to articulate a position on education. It's no coincidence that the last Republican president was very, very good and talked a lot about education.
Right.
Lamar Alexander talks a lot about education, but we don't have as many as we need to that can paint a compelling picture of how you improve the educational system.
Good point, which is a good transition to 2016. So last night we had...
And by the way, I would say the last two Republican presidents, because frankly, George W. Bush Sr. was very strong in education. I mean, we may disagree with those policies, but they articulated very strong commitment to education.
Good point. And there's another Bush who could
is very strong in education as well.
Which gets to my next point. So probably in Tallahassee yesterday and in presidential suites around the country, there were men and women who are thinking about running for president, surrounded by family and consultants, digging into the results yesterday, wondering, what does this say about my chances? What can I learn from these elections that might make me the next president? Who do you see as being the early winners and losers, to use a hackneyed journalistic phrase, in 2016 based on these results? Who can find some good things in these numbers, and who should be worried about what they tell the numbers?
He's more the expert on Republican primaries.
Well, I also want to talk about Senator Clinton, too.
Oh,
Secretary
well, I can easily answer that.
Okay, I mean, I don't know that it's particularly productive to try to squeeze losers in a presidential campaign out of this. What we learned was what else am I going to ask about? And that is, there's no one faction in the Republican Party that is large enough to produce a presidential nominee.
Right.
I mean, you can't run from one particular slice and hope to win the nomination. So whoever wins it will demonstrate an ability to join Tea Party, libertarian, establishment, social conservative, and internationalist Republicans all in one coalition and get enough of each of those groups to build a majority.
Given these numbers I talked about earlier, is that more likely to be somebody outside of Washington who's gotten things done in a governor's office, or somebody inside of Washington who's been a legislator?
Governors frequently have an advantage, but it all comes down to the quality of the candidate, I think. I mean, to go back to one of our earlier points, candidate quality really matters.
Yeah.
And what's more important is the caliber of the candidate and their ability to lead and paint a vision for the country than where they come from.
Gotcha. Slinda?
I really agree, by the way, with what Whit is saying, and I think the difference in, I mean, if you think about 2012, where we ended with people declaring they weren't witches and that there was legitimate rape, and the quality of the candidates in 2014, it was really dramatic. If quality of candidate matters, then I think Democrats are in very good shape, because we have as our front runner Secretary Clinton, who is considered a supreme quality candidate by the voters. If women were a problem, then I think the Democrats are in very good shape, because we have a woman candidate who really speaks to women's lives, always has mobilized women voters, and can be very, very effective. And if the Democrats need to communicate that we have an economic message, that we have an economic plan, and that we will fight until this economy is back on its feet for ordinary people, then I can't imagine anyone better to nominate than a Clinton. So I think that 2016 is really good, and I plan to be on vacation all of 2015 until 2016 comes.
I want to push back on that, but first I want to underscore you guys' points about candidate qualities. I live in Virginia, and when I was walking out of the voting booth yesterday, after really not deciding who I was going to vote for until the last minute, I realized, boy, I wish more people had a choice like this.
As good as you did.
Gillespie and Warner. And I think there's a reason why that race was so close, because it was one of the places where people really had two good choices. Secretary Clinton. So stipulate everything he said is there about her qualities and the demographic makeup maybe favoring her. But again, this is an electorate that is really down on all of its institutions, not even just political institutions, but all our institutions. We have lost faith in them. We're really pessimistic and down on Washington and really, really down on politics. Secretary Clinton, for all her strengths, is an institution. The Clintons are an institution. She's a creature of Washington and a political figure. How, in an era when people are looking for change and freshness in a new way of governing in this new century, how does somebody with her background break through that? And besides being the first female president, how does she make herself the change agent that I think the next president's going to have to be?
See, I don't think, I disagree with you sincerely a little bit about this change notion, because it wasn't a pure change election. Because if it were, Republican governors would have lost too. It was an election that sent a message: get something done for a change. That's the change that people want. And I think Hillary Clinton, in her own record, and Clintons in general, communicate a very different kind of notion of getting things done.
So you think it's a competence thing, and that's what she would run to?
It's competence, it's qualifications, it's getting things done, and the ability to compromise to do that. I mean, people do think you have to work together to get things done, but that is the history there. And people have very, very positive memories of the Clinton years, perhaps more positive than they were at the time. Secretary Clinton herself has shown ability to work with the person that beat her in a primary, work with Republicans, Tom DeLay, and she authored the foster care bill on children. So I think that what last night was a mandate about was get something done.
Gotcha. Before Whit answers, responds to that if he wants to, in a few minutes we'll be taking questions, and if you line up at the microphones there, we can take them. Do you agree at all with what Celinda's saying about Secretary Clinton? That's an interesting argument.
There is no question that Secretary Clinton will be a very formidable candidate. I don't think anyone believes she won't be. I will tell you that it is exceedingly difficult for one party to win 3 presidential elections in a row. History suggests that it is a very unusual event. It occurred in 88 with George H.W. Bush, but keep in mind that Ronald Reagan was a far more popular president than Barack Obama. And so making the case that you are the candidate to follow an unpopular president for a 3rd consecutive term for one party is going to be a very challenging case for her to make.
Besides that history, what else cuts against her? Because, you know, we defy history all the time.
And by the way, I think that people think that a Clinton presidency and Obama presidency would be quite different. I mean, I think a lot of people are now concluding, rightly or wrongly, that while Obama was changed, that he didn't have as much experience as we needed to actually get things done. Nobody questions Secretary Clinton's qualifications and experience.
Secretary Clinton was a part of the Obama administration and a key component of the national security foreign affairs team that people now disapprove of Obama for handling. It's going to be real tough for her to separate herself from an administration in which she served.
Okay, I'm sure we have much smarter questions out there than I've been able to come up with. Anybody have any questions of these two smart thinkers? Sir?
Hi, Robert Schlesinger with U.S. News and World Report.
Hey, Robert.
Anyway, Celinda, you talked about the Democratic agenda on the issues winning. You mentioned minimum wage, but you also mentioned legalization of pot. Were you saying that's part of the Democratic agenda now?
Well, it should be.
Why?
Oh, well, the voters are in favor of it. And
Well,
our drug laws are a nightmare. I mean, and the unfairness of our drug laws in terms of incarcerating young African-American males, this is an insane policy. We should be legalizing marijuana in this country.
Should we be legalizing marijuana or changing the disparity of the sentencing?
We should be doing both. And a majority of Americans support legalizing marijuana.
Sir?
Bert Ely, banking consultant. Be interested in your comments with regard to how the election outcome in the Senate might have some impact on the president in terms of his judicial appointments, and specifically if a Supreme Court justice decides to retire over the next 2 years, how do you think that's going to play out, both in terms of who he might nominate as the replacement and how the Senate might deal with it?
That's yours, Celinda.
Well, I was going to say, in some ways, I think, honestly, the next panel is more, I mean, I don't want to speak to your expertise. My expertise is nothing more than what I would have read in National Journal, which is the place to read it, on these issues. But I think many Democrats hope that everyone stays healthy for 2 years.
The quick answer is it's going to be a very different nominee who can get confirmed now than it would have been before.
Any more questions out there? While you guys are thinking your questions, I want more from the audience, please. Could each of you really quickly mention the biggest warning sign you saw in the results for your party? What was the biggest red flag for your party you saw in those results?
I would say 2 red flags. Well, God, how many? Are they serving? Is there Irish whiskey for the coffee yet? So a couple of things. One, turnout. And we had unparalleled turnout operations. But I think 2 things. One, I think we vastly underestimate and don't have near enough respect for the turnout operations of the Republicans. I think they've caught up. I think it doesn't look like ours, so we don't tend to respect it. Their voters are different than ours. They have a very good turnout operation. We underestimated it in 2004. I think we underestimated it in 2014.
I spent some time looking at the RNC micro-targeting effort. It's real.
It's very real. And if you talk to the pollsters, I mean, frankly, one of the places of bipartisan cooperation is usually the pollsters. And, we've known it's been really real for a while. The second thing I think is, the second thing is, we're not going to win anything if we're not ahead on the economy. We never have and we never will. And as Democrats, the number one thing we need to do is lay out our economic plan and agenda for the future that ensures that everyone in this country can have a chance of prosperity for themselves and their kids.
So you sound like Clinton in '92, and we needed even more than that.
And we need even more than that.
Let me just second what Celinda said about the Republican turnout operation. The operation that Reince Priebus at the RNC and the National Republican Senatorial Committee, the Congressional Committee put in place is light years better than it was 2 years ago.
That's right.
We got our butts kicked 2 years ago, and we've learned and we've adapted, which is one reason
By the way, my column today will be on this. Everybody make sure they see it this afternoon.
Which is one reason why no one political party ever has a lock on anything, because eventually you get tired of losing and the other party adapts and figures it out. The biggest warning sign yesterday was exactly what we've seen coming, and that's the inexorable march of demographic change. The electorate was 2% less white this year than it was in 2010. It will be 2% less white 4 years from now than it was yesterday. We got a third of the Hispanic vote. We've got to do better with Hispanics, with Asians. You've seen that coming. It's not arguable. And it's simply the challenge that we have to meet successfully if we will ever elect another president.
Math is math.
Math is math.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thanks. I'm Sarah Lynch from CARE. I appreciate your comments about the female voters. Curious if you could shed some analysis on some of the female candidates that won last night.
Yeah, so I would love Whit to comment as well, because I don't pretend to be an expert, so Whit, correct me when I get it wrong, but to me it seemed like the year of the Republican woman candidate. And there are 2 things that I think or 3 things that I think really, maybe Pollster's always talking threes. There are 3 things that I think happened. One, Republican women made it out of Republican primaries better than they have in the past. Our primaries, Democratic primaries, are about 58% female. Republican primaries are about 45% women voters. Our primaries include some of the voters who are most in favor of women candidates, African Americans, liberals. Republican primaries traditionally have included some of the voters who were least in favor of women candidates, born-again Christians who took a more conservative role toward that. And so what you saw is Republican women really having a hard time getting out of their primaries. And whether it was Love in Utah or Ernst in Iowa, they got out of their primaries. And I agree with Whit that Joni Ernst is a real model. She's a real right-winger, and yet she was able to use her gender and bracket not just every faction of her party, which was remarkable, but frankly, independent women in her state as well. So she's a real model, I think, for future Republican women. So I think that, you know, last night was the year of the Republican women, and I believe we now have a record number of women, still way too few, in Congress, and a record number of Republican women in office.
Now, Lise Stefanik, who helped me work on a book in 2005 at Harvard, is now the youngest ever Republican female elected member of Congress, 30 years old.
Yep.
Wow.
Barbara Comstock won a huge victory yesterday in a swing district in Northern Virginia.
What's happening?
What's happening is that you have better, more qualified, more capable females that are running and doing well. I hope that in the future, not all Republican females will start an ad with the word castration in it, which gives some of us a little bit of the willies. But the fact is, she
carried it off well.
But she carried it off beautifully, and it was it was a hell of an ad, and it was a hell of a campaign.
Yeah, it was a good campaign.
You have a question there? I would like to end, if we could just pull back a little bit. I'm so interested in how fastly changing the populace is and how that's affecting all of our institutions and leaders of any institution. For a pollster, we touched on this earlier, you know, it's really got to be, you're really at the cutting edge of change in how you identify and pull quality information out of people, given how we're bifurcated and different. Tell me how the polling industry has changed the last few years, and where do you think it's going?
I'll be glad to answer that question. I want to point out one demographic change that we haven't discussed today, which is also huge, and that is the rise of unmarried voters. Half of America now unmarried. Half of births under 30 to unmarried women. 42% of all births to unmarried women. We talk about education, with something I think that we have to bipartisanly work on is in 5 years, half of every kindergarten class in this country is going to be the children of single moms. So this is
a majority of them will
change.
be of color too, by the way.
Yes, that's right. And in places like Omaha, it's already true. Not the place you would have thought to see this change. So there is a sea change going on out there, and actually the electorate is slow to reflect it. And I think it's going to demand a lot of changes in policy and a very different kind.
Because a disproportionate number of those people are staying home, unmarried
That's
women.
right. Okay. Last night, if unmarried women had turned out at the same rates as married women, we would have won a lot of those Senate seats, because unmarried women voted at 61 to 65% Democratic. Married women voted Republican. So this is a huge change, and getting that vote to turn out to vote is very important. In terms of polling, I think all of us, Whit still has his hair, but there are a lot of pollsters who don't. Both of us have more gray than we want to admit, because we're trying combined methodologies, I think. Right now, at least, we on our side try much more a combination of cell phones, online, over the telephone. We call back more. We're in the field for longer periods of time, because it's much more difficult to reach people, and we have to try multiple methods.
Where do you think polling will be 10 years from now, Whit?
Our industry is in the midst of the same kind of transition that occurred in the 60s, when we moved from door-to-door interviewing to telephone interviewing. And we had many of the same kinds of complaints then. Not everyone has a telephone, for example. We're in that same sort of transition now. I mean, if there is a survey that doesn't include cell phones, you shouldn't pay any attention to them, frankly. I am not exactly a young person anymore. I don't have a landline.
Wow.
So the idea that you can do a legitimate survey without a very significant portion of cell phones is fanciful. I mean, we've gone from 20% to 30%. We're going to be at 50% very, very soon here in our samples. But then ultimately, we've got to figure out how to go to online data collection. And that has all kinds of challenges regarding randomness. You have huge panels, but you've still got to opt into the panels.
Right.
And so we are in that transition period. 10 years from now, most of our data, I think, will be collected through some version of online data collection. But we've got a lot of methodological challenges to sort out between now and then.
I like the comparison to the 60s. Listen, this was really interesting. I thank you guys so much for coming and helping us out.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.